The raid on Lorient was a British amphibious operation in the region around the town of Lorient from the 29th of September to the 10th of October 1746 during the War of the Austrian Succession. It was planned as an attempt to force the French to withdraw the forces from Flanders to reinforce their own coast. At the same time, as Lorient was used by the French East India Company as a base and supply depot, its destruction would serve British objectives in the East Indies. Around 4,500 British soldiers were embarked, but the ships carrying them had to wade off the Lorient coast several days, allowing the town to organize its defenses and call in reinforcements from other towns in the region. The British troops only arrived in the outskirts of the town on the 3rd of October, and negotiations for the town's surrender were ended on by the bombardment of 5 to 7 October. On the 7th of October, the British force was ordered to retreat. The British engineers' incompetence and losses to disease and fatigue forced the commander to stop his offensive. At the same time, the French commander originally planned to surrender, believing his enemy to have an overwhelming numerical superiority and knowing the weakness of his defenses and the poor training and weaponry of his own troops. He made a surrender offer on the 7th of October, shortly after the enemy's departure, and never received a reply. The raid is notable for its military results, such as forcing the French to develop fortifications in southern Brittany, but also for its cultural consequences, such as starting a controversy between David Hume and Voltaire and giving rise to a cult of the Virgin Mary in the town, along with several songs describing the siege. Background: War of the Austrian Succession. Following the capture of Louisbourg in 1745, the British government contemplated launching an attack on Quebec which would hand Britain control over Canada. The Duke of Bedford was the leading political supporter of a campaign. A force was prepared for this, with troops under Lieutenant General James St. Clair to be escorted by a naval force under Admiral Richard Lestock. It was ready to sail by June 1746. However, it was decided that it was too late in the year for an Atlantic crossing and operations up the St. Lawrence River, and the British were alarmed by the sudden departure of a French fleet under Danville, as it would be impossible to reintegrate the British force back into another one. Thomas Pelham Hollis, 1st Duke of Newcastle, suggested to James St. Clair that it be used for a landing in France. George II of England heard about the proposal and asked the general if a plan had been prepared. The general told him there was not yet any such plan and that he did not know where such a landing might be made, but proposed the general study possible landing places on the French coast. In a meeting with the king, Newcastle insisted that the plan be carried through, and on the 29th of August St. Clair received orders to proceed to Plymouth to await orders for the operation. Origin of the British planned decision to attack Lorient. At Plymouth, St. Clair received orders to sail for the French coast and attack Lorient, Rochefort, La Rochelle, Bordeaux, or any other town as opportunity presented itself. In a letter of 29-30 August, he favored an operation against Bordeaux, an area he already knew and which was unfortified. Lorient was also far enough to draw off French troops from Flanders, where they were proving very successful under the Maréchal de Saxe, overrunning Austrian territory and winning several victories such as Fontenoy, Rougort, and the Brussels Admiral Anson was also in Plymouth. He met St. Clair and informed him that he knew the town of Lorient in southern Brittany was poorly fortified. It was therefore decided to send the naval force to identify possible landing or raiding sites along that coast. At the same time, Newcastle began to support a plan to land in Normandy which had been produced by Major MacDonald of the General Staff. MacDonald was sent to Plymouth to defend his plan in person before St. Clair, but St. Clair decided that MacDonald was ignorant in military matters, and if he switched from Lorient to Normandy now he would have to send his ships out on another reconnaissance mission. It was finally decided to send the expeditionary force against Lorient, since it would reap a double benefit. Firstly, the town was the headquarters of the French East India Company, whose activities could be stopped by a raid on the town, and secondly, it would act as a diversion for the French force in Flanders. British tactics had evolved since the War of the League of Augsburg. Instead of bombarding ports and raiding the coast of Brittany as it had done during the conflict, Britain shifted more and more to larger amphibious operations such as the 1694 Battle of Camaret. Vice Admiral Richard Lestock was court-martialed due to his implication in the defeat at the Battle of Toulon and appointed to head the British fleet for the new operation in Brittany in February 1744. He had at his disposal 16 ships of the line, 8 frigates and 43 transport ships. Shortly before the expedition's departure, the historian and philosopher David Hume became secretary to James St. Clair, in command of the land offensive. St. Clair's force was made up of the 1st Battalion of the Royal Regiment, the 5th Battalion of the Highlanders Regiment, the 3rd Battalion of Bragg's Regiment, the 2nd Battalion of Harrison's Regiment, the 4th Battalion of Richball's Regiment, part of some battalions from Frampton's Regiment, and some companies of Marines, numbering a total of 4,500 men. The commanders were doubtful as to whether Brittany was the best target for the raid, preferring Normandy. Brittany was not well known to the British. St. Clair could not acquire a map of the region and had to use a small-scale map of France instead, whilst Lestock knew nothing about the town's defences. The landing force was also unable to acquire horses. The fleet left Plymouth on the 26th of September and passed to Chant without being intercepted by the French. French context, intelligence and preparations. The French staff had been informed of the importance of the troops stationed at Plymouth by their intelligence services through interrogating British prisoners, but this had not revealed the force's intended target. An agent on the ground sent a message that the force had little food and few horses, suggesting a small-scale raid on the French coast. The commanders of French ports on the English Channel and Atlantic coasts were notified, notably Port Louis on the 24th of September. Coast Guard militias were sent to the coast, though British reconnaissance along the coast went unreported. At the same time, ships under McNamara were ordered to head for Lorient and wait. Situation around Lorient. At the end of the 17th century, the coast of Brittany was gradually covered in new fortifications, but the area around Lorient itself was still poorly defended. The citadel de Port Louis, which closed off the Lorient roads, had not been modernized, and only low ramparts protected the city's rear, whilst its coast had no other defenses. The place had become a trading port and a strategic point. Arsenals were built to construct ships for the French Navy and the East India Company. The latter had chosen to move its base from Nantes to Lorient in 1732. It was also a centre for cabotage between Brest, Nantes and Bordeaux. To the town's southeast, Belle Isle gave shelter to ships returning from the East Indies and heading for Lorient. The nearby islands of Huet and Hoduc were fortified at the end of the 17th century to defend the approaches to the main island. A cult of the Virgin Mary developed in the area from the 1620s onwards. Apparitions of St. Anne were reported in the era near Auray, and several miracles were attributed to her during earlier British raids. Against a background of Protestant British forces fighting Catholic Breton ones, raid The expedition sailed in September, reaching the French Atlantic coast shortly afterwards. The two commanders were distinctly uncomfortable with their orders, as they believed the equinoctial gales would make the operation extremely risky, and they lacked any firm intelligence about Lorient and its defences. The troops were landed on the 20th of September, and advanced towards the town. They reached its outer defences and came under fire, which led to the withdrawal. St. Clair reboarded his troops and the expedition sailed back to England. In fact, the townspeople had been about to surrender, so lightly defended was Lorient, and the lack of sea defences meant that Lestock could have sailed his ships into the harbour and landed them on the quayside. Opening phase. Landing. The British fleet arrived off Lorient on the 29th of September after 6 days crossing the Channel and joined up with its reconnaissance vessels. A bark from Port Louis sighted them but confused them with McNamara's ships, which were expected at the same time. Lestock chose the entry to the Lorient roads as his landing point due to his poor knowledge of Lorient's defences. The fleet started to anchor in Poldhu Bay from the evening of the 29th of September onwards, near the mouth of the Later. Despite favourable weather, a full moon and a good wind blowing inshore, Lestock postponed the landing until the following day, leaving time for the French to prepare the defences. Even so, the landing site presented several issues. It was exposed to the wind, running the risk of running the ships against the shore if a storm blew up, whilst it was 16 miles away from Lorient. The landing took place on Saturday the 1st of October after being cancelled due to lack of time the day before. The landing could not take place early in the morning due to unfavourable weather, allowing the Lorient Coast Guards definitely to identify the fleet as British and not McNamara's, and time to organise the defences. The British forces approached 3 beaches and landed in groups between 400 and 1,000 men under a bombardment from Lestock's ships. The first available French forces were the Coast Guards, mainly made up of ill-equipped peasants, with only staffs, pikes and a few muskets. Since 1744 they had been trained for 15 days each year, to limited effect. There were also 3 companies of cavalry with the Coast Guards. This made a total of around 2,000 men under the command of Marquis de l'Hôpital. Even so, only 2 of the 3 beaches could be guarded effectively, and St. Clair took advantage of this to land his troops. Reaction in Lorient. News of a British landing in the area reached Lorient on the 30th of September at around 3 p.m. and several middle-class inhabitants of the city evacuated the possessions towards Hennebont and Vannes. The alert was given and went inland as far as Noil-Pontivy. On the same day, Deschamps requested troops from several towns in the region. They were sent on 1 and 2 of October and amounted to 300 men for Vannes, 2 militia detachments for Josselin, some troops for Rouen, 300 men for Morlaix, a few dozen musketeers for Lamballe, and a little under 1,000 men for Rennes. The retreating French forces arrived in Lorient on the same evening. Peasants and around 2,000 men of the Coast Guard militias managed to fight guerrilla rearguard actions in the countryside separating the British positions from the town. A British reconnaissance force seized Guidel on the first day after fighting peasant troops and forcing them to retreat to Qutven. De l'Hôpital took command of the defences of Lorient on the evening of the 1st of October and immediately held a council of war. He wished to initially leave the defence of the town to the peasant militias whilst his own troops harassed the British troops in the countryside, but the town's inhabitants did not agree and so he relinquished the command. March to the town and French reactions. Approaching the town, The British land offensive started on the 1st of October 1746 and immediately faced difficulties. Rain made the land hard to cross, and the 3 miles separating the beaches from the town made it difficult to supply the besieging force with munitions and supplies. On Sunday, the 2nd of October, most of the British force began marching towards Lorient, but St. Clair did not have a detailed map, and even when he captured prisoners, they spoke Breton, not French, and were useless for intelligence purposes. St. Clair had to divide his troops into 2 columns, one heading for Ploemel and the other going north towards Quimperlé. The first column reached Ploemel safely, but the Quimperlé column was harassed by 300 militiamen coming from Concarneau, and for a time he had to retreat before turning towards Ploemel. The 2 columns rejoined just before Ploemel, which was attacked and sacked before the force moved on Lorient. The British came in sight of Lorient around 3 p.m. and set up camp at Lanva, 2/3 of a league from the city. French reactions: the British force sent a surrender proposal to the town on the evening of the 3rd of October 1746. St. Clair required a right of pillage for 4 hours and a large sum of money. The French negotiators rejected the proposal the same evening. They proposed that the French force be allowed to retreat back to the town with full honours of war and a guarantee that neither the town nor the East India Company's storehouses would be pillaged by the British troops. These terms were contrary to St. Clair's requirements, and he refused them on the 4th of October and sent orders to bring his ships' guns to the town to besiege it. With no horses or pack animals, everything had to be carried on the men's backs. The peasants had also hidden all the food, adding to the troops' fatigue. Many men fell sick or became unfit for duty every day. Several French militia sorties were made against the besiegers during the early days of the siege, but these were unsupported by regular troops, limiting their impact. The main aim was to buy time to allow reinforcements to arrive. On the evening of Monday, the 3rd of October, Major de Villeneuve arrived at Port Louis and took command of it for the morning of the 4th of October until Thursday, the 6th of October, on which date he was replaced by the Comte de Volvaire, the king's commander in Brittany. He was able to interview British prisoners and learn his enemy's weak points. On the evening of Wednesday, the 5th of October, news of the landing reached Louis XV of France at Versailles. He decided to detach troops from the Flanders front and send them to the west. This included 20 infantry battalions, a dragoon regiment, 2 cavalry regiments and an army staff detachment. Siege and retreat. British attempts. British engineers promised to destroy the town in 24 hours but rapidly proved unable to keep that promise. Cannon were delivered without enough shot and mortars without furnaces, forcing them to stop firing. A third of the British troops also had to help transport the artillery, exhausting them. The siege only began in earnest on the 5th of October 1746 and the bombardment the following day. However, the British guns were dug in too far from the town and only caused limited damage. 6 were killed, 12 wounded, 2 houses set on fire, 2 others heavily damaged and 15 more lightly damaged. Mainly built of stone with little wood, the houses of Lorient mainly proved resistant to British artillery fire. David Hume summed up the situation. The men seemed to fall prey to doubt. The sight of a dozen Frenchmen struck terror into our lines. Bragg's and Frampton's troops even exchanged several bursts of fire with them. Everyone was discouraged, and the rain was largely responsible. The route from the camp to the rest of the fleet was rendered impassable. The British force began to shrink thanks to exhaustion and sickness. Only 3,000 men were still fit for combat on the evening of the 6th of October. They had to face malicious sorties and defend the camp on the Karaman Mullen. They gained information from deserters on the 6th of October, as well as from a black slave and prostitutes, made the British believe that a force of nearly 20,000 men were waiting within the town and that a massive counter-attack was imminent. Storms were expected and Selestock sent word that he could no longer remain offshore. St. Clair concluded that he would have to raise the siege. A council of war on the evening of the 6th of October did not come to a definite decision, but retreat was much talked of. The bombardment of the town was still proving unsuccessful on the following day, and during the afternoon the British decided to retreat, abandoning the camp whilst the artillery continued to bombard the town to hide the forces' retreat. Only on Sunday, the 9th of October, did the last troops re-embark, though a headwind prevented immediate departure, and the fleet only sailed on the 10th of October. French defences. The town prepared its defences. Cannon were brought off ships and installed on the town's ramparts. New defences were built and the garrison was boosted by the arrival of troops from Port Louis. On the 6th of October, almost 15,000 militiamen were in the town, but they were all inexperienced and undisciplined. On the same day, the French guns began replying to the British bombardment. Using better quality shot, the French fired chain shot and grape shot, whilst the British used bombs and exploding grenades. The following day, around 4,000 shot were fired against the British. 3 British deserters were also captured, revealing that the British force only amounted to 3,000 men and not the rumoured 20,000. Late 18th century Breton militia song. Les Anglais, remplished d'arrogance. The English, full of arrogance, sont venus attaquer Lorient, came to attack Lorient. Mais les bas Bretons, but the low Bretons, à coups de bâtons, beat them with sticks. Les ont renvoyés and sent them back, hors ces cantons, out of these counties. On the evening of the 7th of October, a British shot fell near the French command centre, leading to a council of war. De Valvar and l'Hôpital backed surrender, thinking that the British were about to reinforce the firepower. The town's commander did not believe that his troops could win, thinking weaker than the British troops, but his officers and the town's inhabitants opposed surrender, stating they were ready to defend the town to the last bullet. It was thus decided to surrender, and on the 7th of October at 7 p.m. de l'Hôpital left the town carrying its surrender proposal. He was unable to find the enemy force and had to return to Lorient around 10 p.m. He suspected a British force and ordered the town's defences reinforced. On the following day, the French cannon and mortars were found in what was left of the besiegers' camp, and that evening the peasants of Ploemar brought the town news of British retreat. The Coast Guard militia harassed the British force as it retreated, but the French cavalry and dragoons refused to take part in those operations. No attempt was made to stop the British fleet as it passed Port Louis on the 10th of October, for fear of a second landing there. The inhabitants of Lorient were also on the alert against British reinforcements landing in the region. News of the siege reached Paris via Versailles, alarming the shareholders of France's East India Company. De l'Hôpital arrived in Paris on the 14th of October and met the king, omitting to mention his mistakes. His account of the battle promoted his and de Valvar's role in it, and thus gained him advancement and financial advantage.